ahead and get started in respect of everybody's time. I'll stop prattling on about the weather and concerts. Thank you for joining us for our August edition of the Huntress Fireside Chat. This time we've got a bit of a special edition here. So a few months ago, we did a 3-part series with our friends at FifthWall on cyber insurance. All of our all of our burning questions there, and made sure that we really covered some fantastic topics there. If you ever want to revisit any of that content, it is available on our cyber insurance landing page, and we'll get somebody in the chat there to plug that in for everybody. But we had so many follow-up questions from folks that we decided to go ahead and do a little bit of an office hours with the community chat this time. So we've asked our friends to join us again. So we've got Reed, who's the president there at FifthWall, and then Will, who's their channel manager. I think we tried to combine those into like Channelger.
Channelger.
But it sounds a bit like Challenger, which, gets that
the channel
video game voice going.
Which I'm about.
So I'll go ahead and have you guys introduce yourselves to those who might not have met you in the past, and then we'll get going. Reed, can you kick us off?
Great. Hi, everyone. Reed Wellock, president of FifthWall. I am, I guess, and have been for quite some time, a pretty dedicated cyber insurance nerd. So been with FifthWall for almost 7 years, and this is all I've been doing. So found a weird niche, stuck with it, and really glad to be here to answer any questions, I think, from really any part or angle of the situation. I know MSPs are brought in the different parts and pieces of it. So glad to be here.
Yeah, and I'm Will. I am a kind of self-proclaimed cyber nerd my whole life. Anytime something in the house broke technologically, my parents would blame me, and they were usually correct to do that. I worked in insurance for a couple of years, and I hated it. And then I quit. And so I didn't do insurance anymore. And then I met Reed, and he said, actually, you can do insurance for things that are cool, like cybersecurity. And I was like, oh, that I can do. So now I've been with FifthWall for about 2 years, and I've really been diving much more into the cyber insurance area, which is definitely way more interesting. And as we've talked about on the webinars and plenty of other conversations you might have had with us, it is changing pretty rapidly, which keeps it interesting, keeps it fun. Also why office hours are good to do.
And that was really the deciding factor behind doing this. And I think we'll probably start doing this a little bit more regularly with you guys, just as unfortunately, this isn't an industry that stays the same. And it almost feels like they're kind of building the plane as it's in the air with it. So I think it changes faster than a lot of other things we're looking at. So in prep, I'd kind of, we talked a little bit about like, what are some of the frequent questions you guys are getting? And then, lovely audience members, anything you want to know, anything cyber insurance related, any tips or information on how to get awesome Zoom backgrounds, ask away in the chat, ask in Q&A, and we'll go ahead and keep these guys busy for the next 54 minutes. But what kind of buzz are you guys hearing, or like what? I think my favorite question is always like, what is the question that made you go, huh, in a booth space recently that somebody might have asked you?
Well, I think there's a lot of webinars out there going on. Like, here's the hottest thing happening in cyber insurance. And I feel like a lot of it is hitting on the same notes that have been hit on for a while. Right. And it's, a lot of it's around eligibility. And so we still get a ton of questions about eligibility. Right. And this is an MSP trying to better understand the process they're getting pulled into with their clients, right? So when the clients are saying, do I just answer this yes, do I answer it no? Like, first of all, be truthful, but what does this do for me in the back end? So we get a lot of questions about that, and we're more than happy to keep digging on that. What is insurance looking for? What's more relevant lately, and what's coming down the pipe? We also get a lot of questions on the back end, right? As far as like, as an MSP, where do I fit in on the IR piece, right? When a claim comes out and the police tape are set up by the carrier, what's my role? Where do I fit? What does that look like? And then I think a big one right now, Becky, is there's a lot of market shifts happening that kind of, in our world, when the market makes a move, it kind of ripples down, right? It flows downhill. And so we get a lot of questions of like, what's happening, right, in the market that will coming, 2, 3, 4 months down the road that we can expect, right? So what's coming down the pipe. So we're happy to hit any of that. And then also, I think just even the minutia, I feel like MSPs, you guys are in the weeds with these applications. You're in the weeds with talking to your clients about it. I know and hope a lot of you are trying to make sure you're at least privy to your clients and where they are in this, right? Understanding their exposure to your exposure. So yeah, Rebecca, I think there's a lot of topics, obviously. I think those are our typical FAQ categories, if that makes sense. Will, would you add anything?
Yeah, we got a question from David, and that's one of the most common questions we get is specifically what kind of insurance an MSP should be carrying. Now, I mean, from the cyber perspective, all MSPs, no matter your size, should have a tech E&O policy, but tech E&O combined with cyber liability. And so I actually just, we look at tech E&O policies all the time. MSPs bring them to us and we'll review them, we'll look over them. And sometimes they only carry that errors and omissions coverage, which basically is, hey, you know what? You did something like, let's say you had a tech turn off MFA on a client's computer because he was trying to troubleshoot whatever, and then forgot to turn it back on. And then there was an incident because of that client's coming after you. That's where tech E&O kicks in, right? It helps with the lawsuit protection and things like that. But a good tech E&O policy, and Reed, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but a good tech E&O policy should have cyber coverage, cyber liability coverage built in, because let's say the attack actually comes from the top. So your MSP gets hit first. So now you have that cyber claim, but now you have a breach, breach is the wrong word, but effectively an RMM. Your RMM causes some sort of incident to happen on a client computer. So now not only are you recovering from your own cyber attack, but your client has a cyber attack that's due to your system causing it in the first place. So they're probably coming after you, right? So there's the two layers there. So that's why a good tech E&O policy should have that additional layer of cyber protection.
And I can speak to that because I think you asked a good question, and you're speaking from a one-person MSP. And I think the reality is that, and I can speak from experience. My wife has started a couple businesses, and she's the only employee. And she asked me this question too, because based on how much you're doing or she's doing and the size, you kind of maybe want to underplay the liability side. And I think the reality is you got to still have to look at the reality of a situation, especially for errors and omissions. You want to have that coverage. You really do. It's really important. And it's something that, especially if you're a small business, it's not too cost prohibitive. And of course, there's always ways to look at it. If you want to scale some things back, but kind of try to take it a chunk at a time. But it's really important that you have that. We got a really good question from Peter that came in. Can you talk about cyber insurance as a separate policy versus cyber insurance as a component of P&C? That's property and casualty.
Reed's going to nerd out now.
Triggered, man. This is awesome.
You give him an hour to talk. He needs at least an hour and a half on this one.
I'll keep it short, I promise. So you get it all the time, and so do we. So do I. So let me give you my my words of not just wisdom, but their soapbox preaches of just me shouting. But the difference here is, let me give you a quick history lesson. There was a carrier, I'll just name it, HSB, Harper Steam Boiler. They created a little tiny product that could be bolted on to general liability, basically other lines of coverage that had the word cyber on them, right? And it said, hey, we'll add this on for you. So if you're a business owner, and I'm an insurance agent, I'm talking to you as a business owner, and hey, you're buying this, you need to buy a general liability policy. It's really important, but guess what? It includes cyber. How wonderful is that? It's really low cost. And they go, oh, great. That's wonderful. The word cyber's in there. So as a consumer, I'm going, yay. That's a huge, huge red flag. And the issue with that is they're very, very underprotected if they're relying on that. Basically, it's really, really, really low limit, barely covers much of anything at all. I won't go into details, but the difference here, Peter, is that is not a safety net. So what you're looking at is you're saying, well, a cyber policy really should be protecting me from those put me out of business type of events. That's what we're facing. There's really not been a lot of instances where those endorsements have actually saved a business. There have been some with really minor ones. It's not their purpose. So if it's, hey, I legitimately want to look at this and consider a policy that is built to protect me from what I know exists today from an exposure standpoint, meaning ransomware, social engineering, business income loss, reputational damage, the list goes on. That's why you look at a separate cyber policy, because they're literally built to do that. I will add this too. If you ever hear I heard those don't pay claims. they're referring to those endorsements because the standalone policies 100% do in fact pay out. So anyway, I'm going to step down off the soapbox now.
They 100% pay out if you answer the control questions properly.
You are truthful. Yes.
You misrepresent. Well, good luck.
That leads into let's tag on David's question and then we'll address a whole different topic. But here,
Sure.
Tech E&O policies, where to start? His local insurance guy doesn't know much about it, which based on these being totally separate policies is not a surprise. Like,
yeah,
who has the best plans for small MSPs?
Yeah. So we also had a question from Matt that said, how do we determine how much cyber insurance coverage to carry as an MSP? So I'm going to kind of combine those if that's cool. So yeah, here's the reality. Agents today, and Will had to live this for almost a year that I subject you to this horrible treatment of working with
until you told me there was an MSP channel, which is so much more fun for me anyway.
Here's the reality, folks. There are really, really good agents out there and they do their job and they do it well. Okay. So I want to make sure that disclaimer's out there. Cyber is really new. And when I mean new in insurance, the last coverage that came out was EPLI, which has been around for like over 20 years. Before that, we're talking decades, right? So it's an industry that really isn't used to new. So the people that work in that industry, they establish niches, really. Hey, I specialize in general liability. Hey, I specialize in workman's comp. And the reality is that's what it takes for them to really be good at their craft as they want to hone in. There are not many that honed in on cyber for quite some time because it's a complicated topic. And it's something that, especially if you're not a young producer, right? And I'm just speaking from age being you're more in tune with technology and hopefully then security and what's going on in the world today. You get a lot of folks that are just they're in over their skis, right? They can't really talk about the security aspect, the exposure. And so that is just the reality. There are some agents, though, I'm just going to say they're really good at talking about cyber, but they've made a conscious effort to dedicate towards that. So who you want to talk to and what is it that we want to recommend? Well, you want to talk to someone that legitimately understands and can say, this is what I do, right? And they understand cyber liability enough to also describe what it does. That's a way you can test somebody. You can say, okay, can you walk me through what this actually does and what it covers? And just listen to see if they actually are speaking to what you know is true as well. And then if they can identify what it is they're protecting against, what are the exposures, what are the perils, right? What's out there that I should be concerned about? Those are two elements. If they answer those really well, then yeah, you're probably dealing with someone good. Also, you want to make sure that you're dealing with someone that has good access. So if you're out there shopping, you want to make sure you're talking to somebody that can legitimately shop for you. Why do we want to shop? Because we're in a very volatile market. And if I'm an agent and I'm just working with 3 carriers, I'm not doing you a service because those 3 carriers could not be underwriting your business class very well. FifthWall, sometimes we go to over 40 carriers to make sure we do our job, just to put that in context. All right.
On an annual basis. Like
on an annual basis.
That's how volatile it is, so you could have a client who this year gets a policy for $4,000 and next year the carrier just decides to make it $10,000. So it's just like the most, you probably have dealt with this with your insurance agents on other lines of business. The normal process is just renew it. But it's like doing this in cyber right now. So it's a little crazy.
Yeah. And keep in mind these carriers, they're operating from pain. So some may have had a bad year last year in certain industry classes and some may not. So who's going to price better? The person that didn't really have a lot of pain. The person that had pain last year that had a lot of claims, they're going to be upping the price for that specific industry class. It's typically how it works. So again, always shop. Make sure you're working with someone that has access, good access. So you can ask that question. Hey, how many markets are you going to go to for me? Is this you're just going to go one and done, or are you going to go and actually do your job as a broker?
To paint some context to this, when I took my insurance licensing exam before coming to FifthWall, I knew I was going to, actually, I think I was at FifthWall already for a month. So I knew I was working for a company that worked exclusively in cyber insurance. So nothing else. We don't touch any other lines of business. Out of 170, I'm in New York State. So it's 170 question exam, 90 hours of studying. There was one section of one chapter on cyber insurance, and there was one question out of 170 on that exam about cyber. So you look at agents, you say, well, they don't really know. It's because they're not even being given serious material around it. So they actually have to take it upon themselves to go explore cyber and say, I really want to get good at this. I want to learn this. And one of the issues is that, to Reed's point, I mean, I used to work for an agency where my boss had been in the business for 30 years. He's like, I'm not really interested in doing more lines since I've already got kind of my set book in a really good spot, right? And it's not a bad business decision. It's just the direction they want to pursue. And that's why you usually find a lot of very cyber specific carriers or specific brokers, similar to FifthWall and a couple others.
No, that makes sense though, that it's not that they're trying to do bad or, not do the research for you. It's they're working with the best information they have. And similar to lots of other people, we never want to admit our own shortcomings. And so I'll do the best for you before I refer you to someone else. So now there's some questions in Q&A. This one I think is a good kind of step back here on some of the more technical of where to find a list of questions that an MSP should ask to see if their client has the right cyber insurance and what they need to do to get paid if there's a claim.
So I'll start. So anytime you're talking about insurance that's not yours, right? You want to make sure you're not making recommendations, because unless you're licensed, if you're licensed, then forget everything I'm about to say. But that's one thing I just make disclaimers. You're not a licensed person, so you don't want to make direct recommendations of, hey, you should have this, you should have that. You should go with this carrier, you should go with that carrier. It's pretty simple, just in that manner. Just don't make direct recommendations. Don't speak to the coverages as if you understand the policy specifically as a licensed individual. But things that you can ask to see if they have the right cyber insurance is you can ask and say, hey, and let me give you kind of context to why I think I would be asking. I'd be asking for a number of reasons. But one is it's important for you to understand if your client is well protected, because it really does fall into risk management, right? When we look at the right of boom and we look at response and recovery, this is an element of that, right? And so you're asking to understand, hey, I'd like to just better understand if you do have a legitimate cyber policy. Do you know if you have a standalone policy, or do you know if you have a policy that's an endorsement on another line? You can ask that question. And they go, I'm not really sure. Ding, it probably means they don't have a standalone policy. How do I know? Well, did you have a conversation with your agent? Like, did they walk you through and did you fill out the application? No, I don't think I did that. Then they probably don't have a standalone policy. Once we get further and you are asking, well, maybe do they have the right parts and pieces to the coverage form? That gets a little bit into that gray area that you yourself as an MSP probably don't want to put yourself out there in terms of liability to start keep asking those specific questions, but you can 100% bring in a partner. And I'll just say this is literally what we do at FifthWall, but you can bring in a partner to come in and ask those specific questions, do an analysis. You can also say, hey, I would like to have an analysis and review done on your policy so I understand two pieces. One, that you are properly protected, and I can have an outside third party licensed person do that. And I also want to better understand my role in the IR, because that's also outlined, right? If I'm your MSP, I'm assuming I'm going to be the call that says, hey, I think something happened, or I think I got hit with ransomware. I'm not sure what's going on. Understanding, again, where that police tape is really important. Will, anything you'd add?
No, I think that was really good. I'm just looking through some of the questions we've been getting here, and it kind of is all building on that same level. How do I know? How do I know? There is an interesting one here on limits, and a lot of this, what this is coming down to, I don't want to get into a whole conversation on the skill of agents around cyber insurance, because I think that can lead us down a rabbit hole that might not necessarily be helpful to the MSP business. But what I will say is that there are a lot of things you can do with the cyber policy. So one of these is about someone having a 10 million policy that dropped down to 5 million, but their contract says they have to have 10 million. There's a lot of contractual language. And typically when you have contractual language, you can get the coverage limit that you're looking for. So carriers really don't like writing 10 million limits, and one carrier most likely won't. Sometimes you can find them, but a lot of carriers are like, hey, we're going to write 2, 3, 5 million. But then what you can do is what we do all the time is build a tower, they call it, where you have coverage sitting on top of other coverage, sitting on top of other coverage. So one carrier says, I'm going to take the first 4 million in losses. Another one might say, I'll take the next 2 million. Another one says, I'll take another 2 million. So you build this tower up to that 10 million limit. So that is possible, but it is hard to do if you don't know what you're doing. And again, I don't want to dive into agents versus not agents
Can I-
are the best way to
Well, can I
approach
really
cyber.
real
But
quick
yeah,
on that piece, just
yeah,
chime in?
please.
And I think just for context for folks, so you understand, like, I like the example of a client that went from 10 million to 5 million. Like, what do we do here? There's a reality of what happened in our, and when I say the market, I mean everything that supports insurance on the cyber side. So you got carriers that provide the paper, you've got reinsurance, you got insurance for the insurance for the insurance. I mean, it does go up. To make a long story short, they made very bad decisions from an underwriting perspective. They did not price this appropriately. And it kind of really, it traveled way uphill, and everyone lost a lot of money, which means in our world, its capacity goes down, meaning the amount of funds to pay out these claims was not what they wanted it to be. So they needed to raise rates and reduce their exposure, meaning they needed to make sure I need to put it bluntly, I need to figure out ways for us to be paying less. Well, I'm not going to go ahead and cheapen our form. We want our product to still be good. So I'm going to lower the limits that are available. And that's what a lot of carriers did. And it was a safety mechanism for them because, one, they wanted to survive. They didn't want to die on the vine, but they need to resupply their reserves, which are actually happening. I'm happy to talk about that later as far as what's currently happening in the marketplace. But that's why you're seeing that. That's really the main reason. It's not your client specifically that they did something right or wrong. It's that the carriers themselves are trying to protect themselves, and they're being very meticulous about who they're going to provide higher limits to. Sorry, that was just additional context.
No,
Yeah.
that makes sense. That in the beginning, this seemed like a lucrative business for insurances to get into. So they sold really great coverage, thinking who in the world would ever need a $10 million policy?
Yeah.
And they sold it for what they thought, cool, we're good. And then flip flop. I mean, people cashed in on those. The reserve is gone. And so they understand risk more. Their actuaries actually have data to work with now to price it more appropriately. And they've got to refill that pool because they probably still have some of those legacy policies sitting out there somewhere that somebody might
absolutely
touch someday. It's those, I mean, you've got people walking around with tons of life insurance before we understood what that means.
Yeah, that's a good example. That's a good parallel. And you saw, and you have now a very, very much increase in demand. So the timing just was terrible for them. I'm going to be honest. I mean, you had a lot of eyes open up because they either got hit, knew someone that got hit, but the claims just started skyrocketing. So the demand started going up, and then they couldn't fulfill the demand. So they had to decrease the limit.
And the demand is still going up. I mean, we saw an article yesterday that said, I'm just looking at it from Globe Newswire, said that the estimated insurance market for cyber in 2023 is 14.4 billion, and next year by 2028 they think it's going to reach 33 billion. So there's definitely people still looking for it, and people are willing to pay for it because they recognize how important it is. And that actually brings me, I actually wanted to bring that up because there's a question in here from Chris. How do you recommend MSPs handle the can you fill out this form request from clients? This is the kind of conversation I wanted to get into because I think that's where the rubber hits the road for a lot of MSPs. We get a lot of concerns around, if I fill this out, am I liable? What if I put an answer here and the underwriter accepts it and then I was wrong? Is that a tech E&O thing? Like, Reed, how would you respond about MSPs filling out questionnaires for their clients?
Be truthful. Be factual. You may have a client that's trying to get you to be more inclined to try to get them the best rate. Don't. At the end of the day, the liability, so the policies between the carrier and the insured, that's a contract. So at the end of the day, it affects them. However, based on the outcome, good or bad, say that they do file a claim and the carrier does forensics and they find out, in fact, that they did not have MFA enabled, for example, and this is what happened with Travelers last year, and they rescind the policy. In that example, you're sitting over here isolated, but the client could then come back at you and say, well, hey, wait a minute, you filled this out and now I was denied the claim. You should be responsible for this. So the way you should look at your liability is not towards the carrier. It should be towards the client. That makes sense. So just to state that. So always represent factually. And then look, there are still so many carriers out there that don't know what they're asking. Okay. They're asking things and it's too gray and it's not very black and white. And we get that all the time. And it's like, well, technically we have EDR. Is this specific product EDR? We get that a lot, right, Becky?
Yeah.
And here's the deal. You can always fill in context on those applications, put it on the margin, put it on the back. But if you're in a place that you feel like this is too much gray area and you want to be black and white, then be black and white. Make it black and white as much as you can, as you want to be, to make yourself feel comfortable. We are also seeing plenty of MSPs look at that and say, look, yes, I'm opening myself up to liability by filling this out for you. And you don't have to say to the carrier, but basically to you, right? And this is a service. And so we have some MSPs that are charging to do this and say, I'm happy to do this, but I'm going to count this as a service that I'm doing for you, right? I want this to be actually included within the MSA that we have in place. And therefore, if there is an issue, it's going to fall under your tech E&O policy and you will be covered. There's things you can do like that. I mean, we can go further in the weeds on that, but I don't have a short answer, Will. You know that. That was a loaded question.
Every
I feel
question's
like there's a
question.
big difference. I feel like there's a big difference between filling it out for your client and with your client. Those are two very different levels of liability.
That's a great point, Becky. And also, I mean, from a business standpoint, one of the things I advise a lot of our MSP partners on is, look, it is a touch point to call up the client and say, let's fill this out together. Now you're going from, oh yeah, I'll fill this out for you, and wasting a ton of time, to actually getting in front of the client saying, look, we can fill this out, but guess what? You don't have some of these things. So let's actually talk about the importance of them. And now you have a touch point, you have a sales opportunity, you have the chance now to have the conversation on how to better secure your client. And that, I think, is kind of the key to all of this, and something that we've begun seeing. Reed, you talked about at the beginning of this call that kind of most of the cyber insurance webinars you watch today, they all say the same thing. They're all saying, what is the state of cyber in America today, or in the world today? And it's the same conversation. Nothing's really changed. It's, oh, we're not in a hard market now, we're in a soft market. Oh, it's just doing this, right? And that's kind of what all the conversations are. But what we're really starting to see, and why the MSP opportunity with cyber insurance is such a big deal, is that cyber insurance is almost functioning like an evolving framework. So you've got things like, CMMC frameworks, IG1 compliance, NIST frameworks, things like that. But really, you have some small businesses that if you were to try and push NIST on them, they'd probably fall over, pass out, I don't know, not understand anything you're talking about. But if you can say, hey, you know what? Cyber insurance is saying you got to be here. You only got to be here this year, but I need you to understand that underwriters every year have required you be a little bit more secure. So I don't want you thinking that we're only going to get you to this point and you're stuck there. And it's an opportunity for you to help get your clients on board with this idea that cyber insurance can actually help my client mature in their understanding of the evolving industry that is cybersecurity. And that's a huge boost in the way that we function, because it's you can't just, and I've had clients who came to me who the year before, they're like, look, I did everything that the underwriter said I had to do. I got MFA in place on all these different software points and all this stuff. And now they're denying me coverage. What the heck? And that's it right there. So if we can get in front of that rather than wait for it to happen, now you're training your client to understand that this is an evolving industry. You can't just say, I'm good, my cybersecurity is set forever. And it just really helps reframe the conversation.
And as an MSP, I have to believe that if you are staying on top of the new requirements, you can proactively go to your clients, not just 3 months before their renewals, but 6 months before, and say, this is what we see coming. Let's start budgeting for those changes now.
Yeah.
Because it's a very different conversation when you can budget ahead of time with your clients, and knowing that can't always be done at the end of the year with a perfect crystal ball of this is how much this is going to cost 12 months from now.
Right.
But also not going to them a month before renewal or at the time that they get declined and being like, well, shit, not only is it going to cost you more this time, but you're going to have to pay me this much more for all of these additional controls.
Yeah. I also look at it as like value. So like what your client perceives as value can often just come across as you being really well informed. And that can instill a lot of confidence. So you get ahead of the conversation, maybe actually you check the boxes. So we have a lot that are like, well, my client has our full stack. Like, what are we talking about here? It's like, well, don't you want to validate that still with a third party that puts their money where their mouth is and is saying, like, let me give a good seal of approval to say, like, you actually are doing what you should be doing based off of what we're seeing the data say that we're paying a lot of money out on, right? And so even just being able to say, look, we actually benchmark this to what insurance is looking for. It looks like you have, this is really good. Like we've done a good job. Like we've done a good job. It's my job now. I'm going to try to stay ahead of this for you. And if there's something else coming down the pipe, let's get ahead of it. Let's make sure we're aware. So really good point, Becky.
So we've got some other questions in here that I want to make sure we touch. This one was really interesting because I think this might tie into some of the add-ons you might need to look into. What are these policies actually covering? Ransomware recovery, PII breaches, wire fraud, BEC gift cards, fake invoices. Like, what are some policies, and then what are the add-ons people need to be looking at?
Yes. I could answer this well, but it's going to be a long one. I'm going to try to keep it brief. So you just kick me under.
I got a really easy way to answer this.
Yeah, please.
You can start talking, Reed. I'm just going to.
All right. So basically, the way these forms have been built today has been, it's a product that they want people to buy. So if they're asking the question, does it cover this? So far, we've seen the forms advancing very quickly to say yes. Fill in the blank. So is it covering first, third-party liability? Yes. Business interruption, reputational damage. Is it covering actual funds lost? So we've got, okay, here we go. We talk about social engineering. We talk about spoofing, phishing, you name it. Into some of the newer, and I say newer with air quotes, like in the past couple of years, cryptojacking. When we started seeing bricking like 5-6 years ago, maybe actually longer than that, right when that started happening. Now they call it hardware replacement. But so my point is we can have a conversation, sit down, and actually walk you through all of this. And this is actually what we do with a client that provides a lot of value. Is they don't have the conversation typically because agents don't always have the acumen to do this. Of what does this actually do? Like if I'm buying a product, what's the product do? What's the thing do for me? And so Will has done this many, many times, even at the agent level, but he'll do it at the client level. And it's just walking through what this is covering. I saw someone ask a question about PCI, fines and penalties. Typically, these are very broadly worded, and they're including any regulatory, anything that the client would be held responsible for from a regulatory position, whether it's state, federal, international, like PCI, in addition to anything the state would hold them against, or at the federal level. Like they're very broadly worded. And so I'm not trying to say like, oh, it'll cover everything. Like this baby's great, don't worry. But it is very broad coverage. It really is. What would you add, Will?
I mean, it covers a lot. And I think the point I would really add to this is not so much the specifics of what they cover, because we can't expect you to remember all of that in this one short call, unless you screenshotted that thing I just shared. But the reality is, why this is important is a lot of times when there is an incident, a client is thinking, hey, Mr. and Mrs. MSP, how fast can you get me back up online? Just get me going. My computer's not working. There's this thing on my screen that says you cannot access unless you pay $300,000, right? So they're ransomware, and they just want their computer to work again. But what they're not thinking about is all that other stuff, that their reputation might be taking a hit. There's going to be legal fees depending on the state they live in. They may have to notify X amount of people or everybody, right? So there's these layers and components that they don't know, and insurance is going to bring in the legal teams to determine exactly what needs to happen. They're going to help it make it happen. And those are all things that you as an MSP aren't equipped to do, nor should you have to. That's not your role. So that way you can focus on what you do best, and that's restoring the systems, right? But the client's going to be pressuring you to get those systems back up online. You gotta say, wait, you got that insurance policy. We got to go there first, because there's a lot of things happening in the background that you and I don't know about. So we got to make sure we check those boxes.
Yep.
That's what I would
add.
I
see some add-on questions I want to hit. So one person actually asked a really good question. I like this. They went the inverse and said, well, why don't we ask what you've seen not been covered, right? So let me put this in two categories. One, we've seen plenty of things not be covered because the form wasn't covering it. Not to say that coverage doesn't exist. It's just whenever you're purchasing these policies, I just mentioned that the market was trying to figure out adjustments and trying to figure out a way to not pay out as much, still have a quality product, but get their reserves up. So there are a couple different ways they did that. Some of them where they would start to lower the limits specifically on certain coverages. And in some instances, they would just pull certain modules of coverage, meaning just the certain pieces, like we'll say electronic theft, right? They'll pull out and just not include. Oh, but we'll include it by endorsement if you pay extra. Again, you want to make sure you have someone with really good eyes looking at this to catch these things. So what we've seen not covered, I've seen plenty not covered simply because they weren't on the form, even though there is coverage that exists for that. But most recently, we've seen invoice manipulation right now is now pretty prevalent. And what I mean is when you see a client who gets spoofed, who then their client gets affected, right? And they end up paying an invoice, whether it was a falsified invoice, whatever it may be. But you almost kind of have a third party type of situation where someone else paid money to a fraudster, but the email came from your company. So they technically are going to try to hold you liable, right? That coverage didn't exist 2 years ago. So we saw a lot of denials for that, a lot. But guess what? The market said, oh, this is happening. If we're going to have a quality product, we should probably include that coverage. And so they wrote the coverage in. So I guess my main point is, we're seeing some things not covered. I don't, Will, maybe if you have any other specific examples, I'm blanking on it. But more so, I guess I just want to point out that it's really important to review the forum to understand what's there and what are the limits. So I know Wilson's in this meeting right now. A lot of the time what he's doing, he's literally looking at the coverage forms when he's doing a policy comparison to understand what's currently in place and is it status quo, right? So we have a template that we work off of to say, here are the 20 some coverages that we know need to be in place that by definition in today's standard market is a quality comprehensive form. What's missing and are they at the appropriate limits? That's what we note in red flag, and we go back to the client and say, let's talk about this because there's some red flags that I noticed.
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things. The first would be not getting you gotta, like Reed said, you gotta know what's on your policy. But on top of that, where we see policies not getting covered, often something not getting covered is often when the controls don't line up with what they said they were on the application. So it's not so much, do they have coverage for this? Do they not have coverage for this? The question is, were they accurate when they filled out that form in the first place? Because let's say this is why we encourage MSPs to be a part of this process too. Because if an if an end client just is given the form and they fill it out themselves, they're just checking yes on everything. I mean, nothing against what they're doing. It's easy, right? Oh yeah, I have these things. Check. It's kind of like when, you're filling out a medical insurance form and you have to just check no to having all these preconceived or pre-existing conditions or things like that. We're just used to it. So they're checking, yes, I have all these security controls. Boom, I got the policy. Now they spend $6,000 on a policy that's not going to cover them if there's an incident because they don't have the right controls in place. So that's one of the issues. Now, the one question I would have, Reed, and I know we were asked this once in a previous webinar, but it's helpful. The whole Lloyd's of London decision on acts of war. That's an interesting one, right? Because it's the kind of thing where we haven't even seen that. I mean, someone tried to claim it. If I remember the lawsuit correctly, someone tried to claim, and a carrier had to pay some huge amount, and they're like, it's act of war. And the courts came back and said, never in the history of acts of war has this been the way that we would apply that definition. So I would even say it's still uncertain and they're still figuring all those things out, right?
Yeah, the new wording they came up with is still really broad. Like basically a lot of the court cases came back and said, I'm sorry, but your exclusion is not specifically worded enough, right? Sure. So how are you specifically wording it to say that this actor was in fact, I mean, they may have been from a nation state and they may be from, there may be context that would make sense, but there's no real way to prove that unless you can come back with proof, which a carrier is not really coming back with. And so we've seen a lot of conditional requirements that carriers still have not. A prime example, there's a conditional requirement that for most policies that you as the insured have a process in place that's verifying any funds you're transferring over a certain amount. So for example, if it's $25,000, anytime that my company is transferring more than $25,000, I have a secondary verification process in place, right? Whether I pick up the phone and call, shoot them a text message, whatever it is. It wasn't until recently that we started to see that start to actually be utilized by carriers, but it's been in the forms for almost a decade, right? Believe it or not, carriers aren't looking specifically to deny claims, especially if they aren't large ones. Like, I know that feels probably counterintuitive to what a lot of people feel about insurance. And I know I'm biased, but the reality is I'm in a lot of these conferences and I talk to a lot of not only just the markets themselves, but the reinsurance market. They know when they deny a claim that spreads like wildfire, right?
Yep.
It's their brand, it's their brand awareness. So unless it's a high payout, typically what we're seeing is, like, I've seen it before. I'm like, I know they did not verify those funds, but the carrier paid out. Didn't even question the conditional requirement. They just wanted to get it done. So it's kind of like, really depends on the scenario, because we're seeing kind of carriers even like they have an out and they don't take it, and they're doing it for reputation's sake.
So similar to other types of insurance, and this is a disclaimer, dumb Becky question. Have you ever seen insurance companies try and negotiate down what they'll pay in exchange for signing an NDA, where we know you didn't quite, you violated our policy, but we don't want a bad reputation. We will pay you this much.
I have not.
Okay.
But here's what I'll say. If that did happen, I probably wouldn't be able to find out.
See it. Okay.
Because they signed an NDA.
So just a random question.
But I haven't, let me tell you this, of the scuttlebutt that I usually am listening for, I haven't heard it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I did put a blog in here of something we published last week. We actually helped one of our vendors avoid $100,000 email compromise scam, not through our new M365 tool, but simply our security awareness and our thing. So it was one of those random invoices. Haven't been able to get a hold of you. We've switched our email address and our bank. Like, this is where the payment needs to go. And our policy is we pick up the phone. And that is on all invoices, not even one of that price point. And so we did our normal policy. The scam artist was so good then that they came back and, oh, sorry, I was out of the office. It needs to go here. So they tried it twice. So, but it was simply that our finance department, and they put, the cool thing about that blog is they put some pointers in there of the things they do for their checklists to make sure that we avoid that kind of stuff. Because it's, it's one of our trade show vendors. And so it's not, $100,000 bill from them is not that crazy. So it was just one of those weird little things that we were able to catch. So, that making sure that even if it's not required by your insurance, you should probably have some documented procedure around.
100%. It's, I mean, what we're seeing that has not changed in the past 5-6 years is that human error is so much easier for a lot of these tactics. And so it's, we're seeing a lot just from social engineering, but then, they're getting so creative at that level, back to your point of, like, they're being bold. So, like, it's not only when they're caught, they're going, oh, caught, I'll back off. It's like, no, they'll double down, which is just crazy to me. But here we are. One question I want to make sure.
Go ahead. Yeah. No, go ahead.
I would say there's one question here that was on the Q&A, and it was around if their question is, since the MSP cyber policy only covers their own firm cyber incident and not the client's, would E&O be the policy regardless of whether or not you include the completion as a service or not? So what I think you're asking is basically like, hey, like, I have, as an MSP, I have tech E&O, which includes cyber. So, like, you have both, right? Cyber, you are correct, is for an event that affected you. If you were the nexus, meaning the triggering event happened on your side of the fence, that is coverage for you. You do have third-party coverage, though, as well, in the case that your event affected other people. Now, what your E&O is for is specifically, think of it this way. Your client, whether they're right or wrong, may find that you have had an error or an omission in your service. And that is a really broad topic. We don't even have to be talking about security at that point. Right now, we're talking about security as it relates. But that's really what that protection is for. It's specifically for them. Doesn't necessarily have to pertain to a cyber event, whether it's yours or theirs. But more often, it's going to be because, at least what we've seen, they've experienced a cyber event and they assumed, well, wait a minute, I thought because I had, quote unquote, IT, thought because I had you guys that we were impenetrable. What's going on here? You must have done something wrong, right? And that's the coverage is there to defend you and in the event of a lawsuit.
Yeah.
Hopefully that helped clarify.
So there's one other question in Q&A that I don't want to skip because I think it was a good one. That I have several clients that are insurance brokers. How do I help them serve their clients with cyber renewals and lower their premiums to keep the clients?
So, and we've seen a lot of MSPs do this in terms, you're looking for referrals, it's a good way if you could find, this is part of our business model, right? If you can find a reliable person that can be representing on the insurance side with the client level, and then you as the MSP are backing up what insurance is looking for, right? And so if you're being proactive on this, which is, I think what you're asking is like, hey, I've got agencies out here that I serve and they have end clients, and I would like to be the resource that they go to help them get ready for insurance. 100%. Like, it's a really good model. You want to pay attention to the basics of like what insurance is looking for. So the reality is, until the broker goes there and they talk to the client, they get the application filled out, we don't really know where they sit. And even then, depending on who the client is, are they a manufacturer? Or are they a school? Are they a law practice? Are they, a nonprofit? The requirements for what they need to have in place, and based on their size, it's going to vary. But we do know there's common items that they're looking for. Like at a base level, MFA has got to be in place on remote access, on email. At a base level, we know that most carriers are requiring segregated backups, right? When we start to get a little bit more advanced, we start looking at EDR, right? And as that's becoming more of a requirement. And so probably my recommendation would be work with those agents to make sure they themselves are informed, right? And actually, this is where we can come in, because we work with everybody, work with agents too, but make sure they themselves are informed. And now you're establishing a nice relationship with them, because if they can go in as more of a risk advisor and say, hey, I got to make sure your insurance ready. Like, do you have these things? All right, great. I got a person, right? We need to get you set up. We need to get you ready. And in fact, let's do this in parallel. Let's go ahead and look at the marketplace and see what they're looking for a risk like you. And we can start to see what gaps need to be filled. At the end of the day, what we're typically doing at FifthWall, if we're working with a client, at base level, we're doing a gap analysis. That's the end goal, right? We want to do a gap analysis against what insurance is looking for. And that way we have a good roadmap to get to where we need to be.
Yeah, I always like to say the thing. So on the FifthWall side, the thing we sell is a policy, but ultimately the service clients need, the service you need, the service agents need is just this ability to know what's going to make a client a good risk for those carriers when they finally look at them. And that's where you as an MSP can really bring a lot of benefit to whatever partner relationship you establish, is that you're that person who can help make the client a better risk to those cyber carriers. The challenge is you can't sell the insurance for the agent, right? So that agent partnership, they still need to know how to sell cyber insurance, and that's going to be the key. So you can say, hey, look, I can get all your clients ready. You just need to get really good at cyber first. So I would definitely make sure just to place that. Okay, so this actually is a good segue, because we have 10 minutes left. And something, I don't know how many of you who are on here were actually part of our webinar series, but the whole point of that was to say, how can an MSP really utilize cyber insurance to improve their MSP business? We got a lot of questions on here about tech E&O, all sorts of things. We'll throw some links into the chat at the end there, just for anyone who had questions about, policy reviews and things like that. But Reed, where's the benefit for the MSP utilizing cyber insurance for the MSP's business now? So they have tech E&O squared away. We've got that taken care of. They have a good policy. They've gone through that whole process. What's the state? How does this benefit the MSP?
Yeah. So when we talked about it, I think we titled it carrot and stick, right? And I still think that's really spot on. For you as an MSP, you have a nice advantage here, because cyber insurance is kind of like the bad cop in the room that hopefully you've been waiting for. Okay. So whether or not you feel strong in your sales efforts, this is a really good way to kind of back up the talk, right? And every MSP is starting either, whether you're just starting, you're well established, you're mature, you have folks that have already adopted your full stack. Maybe you have folks that are struggling just to hear you out on just MFA, right? Just some of the basics. It's really in your best interest to align with, or at least get educated, and then start being proactive with insurance, because you're asking probably the same thing in a just different way. And the way that we typically partner is, again, I'm going to keep throwing Wilson out there because I know he's on here somewhere. He's always on.
He's
so
lurking
throw Wilson
hard.
out. He's lurking. But Wilson, I'm going to call you out, because your job is typically, you're almost like an extended salesperson to our MSPs. but all we're doing is educating. And it kind of just, the rest kind of falls in place. We're educating from an industry perspective. And we're saying, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Insured, this is what insurance is looking for. This is why. They go, oh, and you, the MSP, are probably in the corner going like, yeah, I've been telling you this for years. Okay. Now you're paying attention. So it really is, it's a good way to just have a different approach. And also it's a good way to get someone more in line, thinking differently when it comes to their security posture. I mean, you probably have experienced this depending on the industries you work in, but as soon as someone's required to do something, oh, okay. All of a sudden, maybe room opens up in the budget. And it's a nice way too, to always kind of keep the door open, because I've done a lot of interaction at the end client level. And someone asked a question earlier about like who we typically see we're working with. They threw out CFO, and actually more often than not, it is the CFO we're typically talking. It really depends on the industry, to be honest, but they are typically given that bag to carry as far as like the risk manager. But they're looking to say, well, what do I got to do? But then they're also saying, well, what's coming up? And this is a good way to say, hey, this is what's coming up. This is what you should be considering. Don't just take my word for it, but I'm also benchmarking it to an industry that's kind of calling everybody out. So it's not just you. And I feel like in sales, it could be a struggle if you feel like you're isolating that one person, or they feel like you're just asking me, versus you're saying to somebody, look, this is what's happening. This is a standard. I'm trying to bring you up to a standard. So I'm not trying to say that you need this specifically just to sell you, just for you to buy something. I'm trying to bring you up to a standard. And that's what I would say is like being proactive with this is, again, from our experience, this is just what we're seeing in our partnership. It's been really fruitful, and it sends a good message. Again, at the end of the day, it brings good value because you are coming to the table well-educated, you're well-informed, and depending on who they're working with, who they're not, this could be either groundbreaking to them, or it could just be really helpful context.
Huge.
One question in here that I didn't want to let go by, because I think this might be a good kind of budget planning type question to also cover here, is how do you prep a client for rate increases that may hit them after they've already had a cyber attack that causes them to pull down on their policy? Do you have an average of what you're seeing percentage wise, or is it still?
It is.
Okay.
Lick your finger and see where the wind's going.
The real challenge is that you don't really know what a carrier is going to do, but the real challenge we've seen is actually when they have an open claim, right, Reed? So like if that claim is still open, finding coverage at renewal time is very difficult. The rate increases, I guess the challenge here is a lot of times we think of it as like a car accident, right? Where you get into a wreck and now, oh, I'm afraid to tell my insurance carrier because then I'm going to have I'm going to have an increase in my rates. Well, why do you have that insurance in the first place? You know, you got it to protect you from something like this. So you wouldn't want to hide it. Plus with all that notification stuff we talked about, it's really important. But then you may see a rate increase, but that's why it's important to be able to shop things around, right? So if you're stuck on that one carrier, well, yeah, you might see a rate increase and then you're stuck. But if you have the ability to shop around, maybe you'll be able to find something comparable to what you had last year. Maybe.
There's a reality too, is like when we are standing up our own program, which is really excited. And part of my main goal, which it's not as relevant now, but there was a point in time that no one was writing anyone that had a claim. It was like, so if you had a claim, you had the scarlet letter, you were black marked, you were on the island of misfit toys that would never get coverage. And my theory has been folks that have touched the stove, they know it's hot, they're the best risks because they now better understand the reality of things. Now, that has probably been more distilled now in our industry, understanding, okay, these folks, this is now a norm. At a certain point, almost everyone will have been affected, right? At some point, unfortunately. And so they're getting better at it, but they're still gun shy. And so what you'll typically see is you'll see carriers say, yes, we're going to increase the rate because you got hit. If you want to go somewhere else, that's fine. But they're also going to say, all right, what have you done to rectify this so it won't happen again? Did you plug the hole? And if you increased your security posture? So typically, no matter where you go, if there's a claim within the past 3 years, they're going to ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, so prepping your client about the rate increase is just telling them the realities of both the rate increase, and chances are they're going to have to improve their security to show that won't happen again. It stinks because that means spending more money, but that's the reality.
Huntress is here to help as well. We are an EDR. Surprise, surprise. And we have gotten on the phone with a few people's insurances to explain why we're an EDR for those really pushy insurance brokers who will not accept our policies, who say, no, they're not. We will get on the phone with your insurance company and help explain it. Thank you all for joining us today. And Reed, Will, thank you as always for bringing such amazing expertise, and your ability to answer questions on the fly here is mind-boggling. The amount of information that lives in your heads is a little scary.
We're glad it's of use. I'll say that.
Because a lot of times it's not. It's just random.
Well,
I was going to say, it's got to be really fun at dinner parties.
oh, I'm a blast. Just ask my wife. I'm a hoot. I'll tell you what. I'll tell you about the latest fire policy I was reading last night, and people are very enthralled by it. So no, we're happy to do it, and thank you for having us, Becky. We're genuinely thank you.
Yep,
No,
thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you again the next time.
All right, take care. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks,
ya.
everybody.